This podcast is for singers who have music in their soul and want to be in the spotlight. We are INVICTA Vox Radio.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of INVICTA Vox Radio. As always, we are your hosts, Mike and
Angie Lee.
And today we're going to be talking about something that really holds people back, and it is that most people do not know how to learn. You have to learn how to learn. And I know that sounds really weird, but it's very, very true. And I didn't realize that I wasn't very good at learning until I went to college. For all the things that college doesn't do for you, one thing I feel like it does do is helps you learn to learn.
Yeah, it teaches you how to learn well.
Right, because before that, like all growing up, everything else, I would just kind of do things the way that I would just go into class. Let's just take school, for example, right? I would go into class in elementary and high school, and I was able to kind of do things well enough that I didn't need to really take my learning to the next level. Yeah. Right? There was nothing that was challenging, and I never took a craft or a hobby or anything else to like a very high level, right? So it was always, I would get to a certain point, I would learn things, kind of that beginner's advancement where you learn real quick, and then I would get to a hard sticking point and I'd move on to something else, right?
Yeah, you were like the jack of all trades.
Yeah, and so
but you were really good at math.
Yeah. But even with math, like, right, like it was the same thing. I would just go to a point that was easy for me. But it wasn't until later that I realized that learning is actually a skill. And we see this all the time with people at the studio. Now, I know one of the things that we've talked about in the past that holds people back from learning, and I'm gonna hammer down on this again because I don't think it can be said enough, but one of the greatest obstacles to learning is ego.
Oh, yeah. Thinking that you already know everything and then being uncoachable. We kind of talked about that last time.
Yeah, because nothing gets in the way more than that. So one of the key pieces of learning to learn is let go of the ego and be willing to ask questions. Right? Be
willing to be wrong. Be willing to not know everything.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I used to do this all the time when I was younger, especially when I was a new teacher. Like when I first started teaching and I was super young and I didn't know a lot of music and popular music yet. And I started teaching when I was 16, right? So when I'm 18, I've been teaching a couple years and I'm like, oh, I know this game. I'm so good at this. And people would bring music in to work on with me and they'd be like, oh yeah, and I love this band so-and-so. And they're like, have you ever heard of them? And I hadn't heard of them at all, but I'd be like, oh yeah, their music is really good. and I'd just wait for them to kind of lead me down a path to like knowing who this band was. And then I'd be like, okay, well, what's your favorite song by this band? Let's look it up and listen to it, you know? And I would straight up just act like I knew what they were talking about because I felt like I had to. I felt like this pressure that I should be able to know all this music, even though I was only 18 and I'd only been teaching for a couple years. And so, you know, I have the humility now, even after teaching for 22 years, if someone's like, hey, have you heard of this band before? And I'm like, no, I haven't, but let's look it up. Let me listen to this and let's hear it. Let's check it out. And it's always about staying open and allowing yourself to accept that you don't know everything and be okay with the fact that you don't know everything. And that's okay. And that there's always room to grow and expand. And if you can do that, then you can be open to learning and to understanding the skill of learning.
Yeah. Yeah. It just drives me nuts when people won't allow that wall to come down.
Yeah.
And to just be like, yeah, you know, I'm not the greatest at this, but instead it's like this pride or an ego thing that won't allow them to actually just be able to move to the next step.
Yeah, because they don't want to look dumb, or that if in the scenario I was in, I was like, I just don't want to look like I'm ill-equipped to teach somebody.
Right, which not knowing every band that ever existed has no bearing on your ability to teach somebody to sing.
But it's weird because I bet everyone listening to this can be like, oh yeah, I've totally done that before.
Yep, I've done it before.
Totally.
So, and I'm not in that scenario very often, but it...
Mike's brain is a catalog of all music for all time. Until it's not.
But the second part of that, like briefly mentioned is be willing to ask questions. I know there's like this whole thing like, oh man, I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to ask a stupid question. I don't want to bother somebody by asking them a question. These are all like things that come up, right? And it was a few years ago, so I didn't ask very many questions in college, and it drove me nuts because looking all through school, and
well, because you were kind of shy too, so you didn't want to raise your hand.
I was very shy, so I didn't want to ask the question. But looking back, it just makes me think, dang, I would have been able to learn and grow and become so much better, so much faster if I'd just been willing to ask questions. And one day I just kind of thought about it in the reverse. Like if someone comes up to ask me a question, I almost never feel like, oh, this is a burden, or, oh, I don't have time to answer this question, or anything like that. Mm-hmm. It's kind of an honor when people ask you a question because they feel like you're somebody who can actually help them out and answer that question. That
being said, if you don't know the answer, don't pretend like you do.
Right.
Because that's like going back to the first one, right?
Right. But yeah, like, don't be afraid to ask people questions.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to care or be like, oh, look at this dummy. You know what I mean? Because most people want to help. They feel honored to help. They want to share what knowledge they do have. And so be willing to ask questions. It drives me nuts when we teach these classes. And I know people have questions, but they don't ask them. Drives me crazy.
Well, and especially if you're in a class scenario, I guarantee if you have a question, someone else in the room does too, and it's the same question. And so by being willing to humble yourself enough to ask and to show that you don't always have the answer, you actually help all of the people around you. You help the collective raise to a new level. And that's the whole point of coming up in the industry with the people around you, is having like-minded artists around you and being able to help each other. And if nobody's asking the good questions, then how are you guys going to elevate to the next level? So, Mike, what's the secret sauce to learning how to learn?
Okay. So,
because those are the two things that hold us back from learning.
Right. So, I think to learn how to learn, so there's two pieces of it. One, there's stylistically, how do you learn? Right? Some people are very hands-on. Some people can actually learn from a book. Other people, it's very, very difficult, right? You can build that skill over time. All these things can be developed over time to get better and better at learning from a book, at just hearing something and trying to understand it conceptually.
Or watching someone else do it, or doing it yourself. Mirroring. Yeah. So it's about knowing what the best method of learning is for you, and being able to implement that as much as possible.
Right. In order to learn the quickest, you have to understand how you learn the best. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, it's actually getting in there, getting actual experience, and then finding the gaps, right? Like being able to jump in there and see where you're missing knowledge. And that's really the second piece of it. When you're learning to learn, one of the other biggest things is to be able to understand what you do know and what you don't know. And it sounds really simple. It sounds really easy, but it's actually the biggest part of the equation, really.
Well, because that's the part that plays into the ego and being coachable and asking questions, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't realize there's holes in your knowledge, then you're not going to know the questions to ask, and you're going to think you know everything.
Right. But most of the time, we actually don't take a moment to step back to understand what we know and what we don't know. Mm-hmm. I remember in college, again, I went up to, finally got the courage to go talk to the professor, went up there, had a question about thermodynamics, and I sit down, and he's like, okay, so let's go through this problem. So walk me through it. What would you do? And in my head, I'm thinking, well, I don't know what to do. If I knew what to do, I wouldn't be here asking you what I need to do. But he's just like, yeah, just give it a go. Right? So I kind of set things up a little tentatively. And he's like, okay, that's right. Mm-hmm. And then, like, what would you do next? And then I kind of went into the next step of the process. And he's like, yep, that's right. And I'm like, okay, but now I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So he's like, okay, now that's where you're getting stuck. And it was really like one little thing that he had to help me with. And then I knew every other step after that. So the entire time out of this whole concept, I was only missing 10%, but it was 10% in like the first third of how you would do it, right? So
Yeah.
it made me feel like I have no idea what the hell I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
But really all it was is I was just missing one little piece of the puzzle that once that got clicked into place, then I could do it. And I think that that's so often we don't give ourselves credit for what we actually know.
Right.
And
Well, that's the flip side of the ego, right? Is like the ego telling you know nothing.
right.
And that's debilitating too, when you think that you don't have enough information to move, or you're like, oh, I've only been taking voice lessons for a year. I don't think I can go out and sing yet. It's like, dude, that's plenty of time. Start going, start trying things, start moving. If you're waiting that long to actually do something, you're in trouble. You got to start moving immediately if you can. And so it's that getting held back by your ego telling you don't know enough, or telling you that you know too much, right?
Right.
It's finding that sweet spot of saying, okay, this is what I know, and evaluating that. I'd love that you walk through that problem. Like, that's totally what it is on a daily basis. This is what I know. This is what I don't know. How can I get this information? Who do I need to talk to? And how do I learn it? Not just, have knowledge, but how do I actually implement that into my life and make it part of the core of who I am, instead of, oh, that was interesting,
Yeah.
And you really got that piece clicked into place because you were doing it with him, and you were actually walking through the whole process instead of just watching someone do it. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's learning how you learn. Like, what's your best way of learning? How do you retain knowledge the best? And is it practical? Is it by watching someone? Is it by listening? Is it by doing? Is it by reading a book? Like, what is that for you? And really discover that and really pay attention to that. And once you know that, evaluate the knowledge that you do have of the thing you're trying to learn, whether it's music or anything else, and then say, okay, who do I need to talk to and what do I need to ask? And start asking the questions. And don't worry about if it's a good or bad question. It's a question. Like, it leads to the next thing. And be open, be coachable, and realize that it's a journey and that you're going to take a lot of steps together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember one of the first times that I kind of got that this was actually a concept is, and I'm gonna butcher this, but I'm just gonna throw it out there. There's like one of the Confucius sayings where it's like, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. Yeah. Right? So it's like there's this idea that yes, there's a way to learn, a better way to learn, and then a way that you're going to actually sink in and be able to implement it on the long term.
I love it.
So with that being said, where are you holding yourself back in your learning? What do you need to be learning right now? Where do you think in your musical journey you're held back because you just aren't learning one piece of the puzzle or the next step in the piece of the puzzle? So what do you need to be learning right now?
And what can you do today to get started on that? Do you need to open yourself up to more modes of learning? Do you need to recognize a better way to learn these things? Who do you need to ask?
And with that, we'll just wrap it up. So as always, if you liked the episode, if you thought it was helpful, if you just love us,
want to be a nice guy,
then please share it with a friend. Let other people know. Just tap somebody on the back and whisper in their ear, however you choose to do it, but just let somebody else know. We just want to try and help people as much as we can.
Awesome, guys. And with that,
until next time.
peace.